Welcome to Om on the Range, where we share the practice of meditation, the wisdom of Western Buddhism, and the refuge of our community. Whether you are new to meditation or a longtime practitioner, committed or curious, this offering is here to share solutions, stories, and support. Happiness and better health are available to everyone. It just takes practice. This is Om on the Range. Hello and welcome to Om on the Range. This is episode number 37, and I'm your host. My name is Whit. Welcome. We're glad to have you here. We're very happy to have joining us as co-host today. Bohr and I recently spoke at Temple Buddhist Center. He is a teacher, a practitioner. I think it's fair to say an entertainer as well. Not that you don't have the skills to do that, but I don't know with what you do. I don't know really where that falls in your title.
Sure.
Also, as a Buddhist show, it seems a little weird to come right out and hit you with a bunch of ways to describe you as opposed to just letting you be. But thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And yeah, just so much love to the Temple Buddhist Center community. Had a wonderful time hanging out with y'all just a couple weeks back.
So I think what I'd like to start with is, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got here?
Yeah, so my given name is Ofosu Jones Quarte, and my family is from Ghana in West Africa, and I'm a first generation American, meaning that I was born here in the States in Washington, D.C. And my mother was a practicing Buddhist when I was very young. She began practicing Buddhism, I should say, when I was around 6 years old or so. I'm an only child, and she and I remain very close to this day. And it was no different when I was growing up. We would go everywhere together. She was looking into what we would call these days various aspects of wellness. So she was doing yoga, and she was practicing mindfulness and practicing Buddhism with the Nichiren Soka Gakkai tradition of Buddhism, which is a lot of devotional chanting and finding peace through the practice of chanting and studying the Dharma. So I was just sort of around all of that and absorbing it, and it stuck with me. I was given the freedom to explore my spirituality by my parents, and I'm very grateful for that. And I meandered through all the major traditions and some more obscure, smaller traditions. And then when I got to college, I met my future wife, and her mom happened to be a meditation teacher. I went to one of her retreats, and it got me back into the meditation. I got bit by the meditation bug. And not long after that, we were expecting our first child. I felt a kind of spiritual urgency with the advent of being a new dad. And I was already feeling very pulled to the spiritual traditions of the East. And Buddhism was calling me in particular. I think it's all connected to my mom and a new child, and then meeting my now wife and her mom. Is so much about family and practice, was coming through. And so, yeah, so I set out on this journey to study and practice Buddhism, first in the inside tradition where I have the most experience for the past 25 years or so, but also studying many traditions. I'm currently also in the second/third year of a serious dedicated practice in the Soto Zen tradition. So that's I guess that's the Buddhist story. Along the way, I also fell in love with hip hop as a teenager and as a young adult. And I was listening to a conversation or an interview with the rapper Mos Def. And he was saying that, most people who really love art eventually try their hand at being an artist. And I think that is true for me. I really fell so deeply in love with hip hop music that eventually I tried to do it myself. there was a desire at the beginning of my career as an artist to infuse my work with my spiritual practice. And then there was the realization that I didn't have enough spiritual practice for the work to be authentic. So I was just rapping about how my life was unfolding for some time. And there were ways in which my lifestyle and my spiritual practice were two different things and going in two different directions. And I wanted to find a way to bring them together. So during the pandemic, I had a lot of time on my hands to reflect and to think about where I was going and how I was going. And I decided I wanted to try to make my life a more singular expression, my life as a father, as a husband, as a practitioner, as a musician, as a teacher, and just as a creative person, sort of flowing from the same place and where everything can kind of live under one roof, so to speak. And so that's also how we got here.
So that's a lot to unpack, and I appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing that. Do you think it's true for everyone who practices that at some point your practice evolves to the point where it encompasses all of the things you do? You know, it kind of goes from, okay, I'm going to sit for 5 minutes or 20 minutes or something. And after years, some people try to push it and then maybe it falls apart. But if you let it go organically, my experience was 10, 12, 15 years down the road, it was everywhere. It was, my practice was my life, and I
Yeah.
felt so much more comfortable. It kind of sounds like you've experienced that as well. Is that true?
Yeah, I think what what happens and what I try to encourage people to just stick with their practice, even if it isn't ideal, and even if they are not the quote unquote ideal practitioner. I certainly was not the ideal practitioner. I had issues with drug and alcohol abuse. I had just living in unskillful ways. You kind of living the music, the kind of stereotypical musician's life, and then also trying to live the wholesome life of a practitioner and family man. And the two things were just really at odds with each other. But nonetheless, even though I had some feelings of shame and self-doubt and even self-loathing, I still maintained my relationship with my practice. It was still such an important part of my life,
Right.
even when I felt that I was incongruent with it, even when I felt my own hypocrisy, I still stuck with it. And eventually, I feel that the practice is kind of like water over that's rolling over a rock. Eventually, it kind of wears the rough edges of the rock down. And you find that, I really don't want to go against the flow of the path. I don't want to go against I want to go against the stream of delusion, but not against the stream of awakening. And so your lifestyle eventually adjusts to it. And like you said, it becomes everything. Yeah.
Right. Right. I think that's so interesting that that's a shared experience. There were times when I would certainly practice through a hangover, for example. And it
Right.
wasn't so much that it was punishment or that I had to go do it. It was just two lives that I was leading. I didn't want to miss the time sitting, and I look
Absolutely.
back on that. And it surprises me even now. I still got up early and practice, and I finally got to the point, like you said, that water that you spoke of finally made me realize it's like, hey, this is really who I am. It's not a question of this is right and that's wrong.
Right.
It's just this is who I am. And you can only utilize so many different things to deny who you are if you have a practice, if you have the space and the ability to
Yeah.
kind of find out who that is. That's interesting. And I really enjoyed your talk that you gave because you were so forthright and open about that phase of your life. And it didn't come across as being, as being guilt driven or,
Mhm.
again, I was bad here, but now I'm good. There was none of that. It was
Right.
just like, that's who I was. And it just wasn't me after a while.
Yeah.
So it makes change so much easier, right? When you're following that authentic version of yourself, whatever that is.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing, and thank you for what you shared as well. I resonate with that so much. Like, yeah, it's just sitting through the hangover, and I don't want to miss that part of my life, and that's that kind of sharing with you. That pull is letting you know, like, this is what is really important to you. If you're willing to face yourself, not even in a harsh way, but if you're just willing to sit with yourself, under any condition, under hangover conditions, then
Yeah.
this is something that is really meaningful to you. I think what I love about the teachings of the Dharma, I think relevant to our discussion here, is this idea that our identity is not fixed. Who we think we are, so to speak, is always changing and changeable. And we can bring a consistency to that, to our changing nature. And that's what we're kind of talking about, is being consistent in our practice. But we are also free if we happen to be in a pattern that's unwholesome, or happen to be in a situation that isn't congruent with where we want to go, we can change. And that's the liberation that's always there, the freedom to change, to go deeper, to go further, to pull back. We have that freedom that's already baked into us. And I think there was a part of me that began to recognize, well, yeah, I can do my life differently. And yeah, I can let the practice be my North Star and see where that takes me. Yeah.
So you started practicing at a pretty young age. You had some experience with that. But how valuable, when you look back on that time, do you think that was to your development? Did that make being a youth and an adolescent, whatever you want to call that, those awkward,
Yeah.
10 to yesterday years, you know, did that make it easier? Did that make it more, I don't know if honest is the right word, but what was
Hmm.
that experience like?
I think I'm not sure if it was the exposure to Buddhism or just my own inquisitive nature. I was it was encouraged, particularly by my dad, to find the interconnections in life. Sometimes he would do these thought experiments, point out two things that seemed very disconnected, like a fork and a vase or something. And he would ask, how are these two things connected? And it would kind of break my brain as a single digit young person. But he was always interested in how one thing can be like another, even if it doesn't quite seem like it is. And there was a lot of unofficial dharma that I experienced growing up. At the same time, sometimes I didn't really know what to do with the questions that I had, the big questions, the big spiritual questions. I think there were times of existential wondering and confusion and all of that. So, what I think most happened with me spiritually as a young person was just a deep search, being a seeker, and wanting to have a relationship with God, the universe, the ancestor, whatever the great all was, wanting to
Right.
have, wanting to be as close to that as possible. And something that I've also shared and try to be candid about, is just I also had some mental health stuff as a kid, depression and anxiety, and living with a kind of latent obsessive compulsive disorder that really sprung forward when I became a dad and just started life on in my early 20s, started fatherhood in my early 20s. And so that also impacted how I was experiencing the world and really getting in touch with that first noble truth of suffering and kind of swimming around in that noble truth for a while. Yeah.
Right. Right. Um, I found it to be so freeing. And I think this just comes from spending time with yourself, from just having a practice and sitting, just that getting comfortable with suffering. And,
Hmm.
it kind of flips at some point, at least it did for me, where you go from pushing it away, and wanting to deny it, maybe wanting to medicate it or, do anything other than be with it, to after a few years, you start to look for it
Hmm.
in yourself and you start to, it's a demon that you welcome, whatever that demon is, because
Hmm.
you realize that's the way that you go through it. And I loved your talk because again, you were so honest and not obviously you'd overcome a lot and you still are, but you just seem so comfortable with what you'd been through and what you were dealing with. And I think that's such a strong mark of someone who has a strong practice and is truly authentic to who and what they are. Even even though that's a moving target, right? You're still evolving.
Moving to
But I just found that, and again, most people in our sangha or true practitioners, whatever that means, that's the one thing they exhibit is that they are authentic. So there's that trust that you can have with them.
yeah.
At least that's how I feel. But I love that about your talk. And I thought it was so well presented. It was great to hear. And it's always great to have somebody who can be so eloquent and also be so honest and in the moment. So thanks for all that.
Really appreciate that. And it just makes me reflect on the evolution of my life that my practice has offered me. And part of it is sometimes sitting in the front of the room, holding the teacher seat, and working with my own imposter syndrome around that, and wanting to simultaneously hold the seat with a lot of reverence and a lot of care, but also with as much transparency as I can, just to humanize the whole thing. It's like we're all practitioners, we're all on our journey. I've been doing it for a while, and this is how it's been going for me. And that's the extent to which I feel comfortable expressing myself. And I had the idea when I would see somebody at the front of the room that they had it all figured out, or that they weren't experiencing, this is one of my favorite Buddhist words, the vicissitudes of life, the ups and downs, and getting dragged all around by this feeling and that feeling. After practicing for a long time, like you said, those experiences, they don't go away, but we are not afraid of encountering them anymore. And that makes all the difference as far as I'm concerned. And I just want to be able to come from the heart when I'm sharing with other people, and demystify perhaps and humanize, because I wanted the practice to be this mystical superhuman thing. I wanted to overcome suffering and become something that wasn't me. There was a driver of self-loathing or self-hatred that was like, when I practice hard enough, I will become not me. And what I found was like, wow, practicing in that way really hurts. Actually, what I'm becoming is the truest version of me. And so much of this practice is learning to accept and heal and acknowledge and be with what is right here, right now. I don't think I could be expressing myself. I don't think I'd be being true to myself or actually being of any benefit if I was doing it another way.
I really enjoyed also when you were talking early in your presentation about trying to practice metta and having a bit of an anxiety attack while you're getting up there. Because again, it's so good for the people that are there to learn from you and experience how you teach and what you've learned, to see that most human side and to see that real courage to like, yeah, this, it's not ideal to feel anxiety when I'm supposed to be up here leading this, but it's really the perfect thing. And this is who I am. I don't know if I'm a better version or a stronger version. Well, actually, I do know that because this is the true version. So
Mm.
I know fear is what got me into practicing. And I really couldn't even define what that fear was. But there were two things. There was fear that I couldn't define and didn't know what to do about. And I didn't want to pay anybody for how to get better. So after reading some self-help books, it became apparent to me that the only book that would ever work is the one I wrote, because everybody's different. So again, just felt so connected with how you approached that talk. It was a great balance of some of the Dharma, but also just of your experience and who you are. Uh,
Mm.
and to see somebody who can control a room like that, but does so without that ego, does that more like a friend, was tremendous. So really appreciated that. You talked a little bit about dealing with that inner critic and instead maybe developing kind of that inner friend.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that starts and where it takes you?
Sure, sure. Thank you for those really moving and kind words. When you're talking about the book, it reminds me of a quote from Ajahn Chah, that there's only one book worth reading, your own heart.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I was having a really hard time in my practice. The compassion part the loving kindness part, the friendship part, all of those parts of the practice that were presented as just as essential as the wisdom and the insight and the deep meditative states. I just felt like I either wasn't worthy of them or they didn't apply. Maybe they weren't strong or macho enough, or I'm not really sure what I was denying myself for. Probably all of the above, and probably just this feeling of like, I don't know that I deserve compassion. I don't know that loving kindness is for me, but maybe when I get enough insight and enough wisdom, then I can send loving kindness to others. And in that model, I really incurred a lot of spiritual injury, just feeling worse about myself, feeling like my practice wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough. Couple that with what I was sharing before, that my way of life wasn't always in alignment with the ideals of my practice. I was just in the pits, but I wasn't willing to give up my practice. And I was just kind of at my wit's end. And this voice that was always indicting me and always judging me and always saying that I wasn't doing it right, I wasn't getting it right, I wasn't going to amount to anything, all those things. I recognized that, well, if I've got a voice in here anyway, could it be a little more kind? Is it possible? And there's a much longer kind of arc to arriving at this place, but what basically started happening is I just started experimenting with being aware of whatever the narrative was in my mind about any given thing, and then just kind of asking, well, could I be a little bit more kind towards myself in this moment? What would that look like? And it began to be like, well, what would I say to a friend who was experiencing what I'm experiencing? How would I treat somebody that I care about if they were going through whatever I'm going through? And usually it began with difficult circumstances. How would I treat somebody who was experiencing this difficulty? But then I began to notice that when good things would happen, I wouldn't really savor them or enjoy them. It would be kind of like, okay, I checked that box and now it's time to do the next thing. But with a friend, I would give a high five or a hug or just reaffirm how hard they've worked for this or that. So just learning how to be a true friend to myself, to catch myself when I'm falling, or to introduce another way of thinking about something, especially when the self criticism is really loud. It's been a process that I think has really saved my life because the friendship relationship inside helps guide life decisions that are more for my benefit, you know? So it's been this process over time. It's been this really simple model. What would I say or what would I do for a friend in this same situation? And I was wondering, does this really line up with Dharma? The practice of loving kindness traditionally begins with oneself. And just because we have these kind of historical phrases that we use, may I be this, may I be that, we can always adapt those to language that fits our lives in the present. And that language can be very specific. As you were saying, each one of us are different. So, what are our own words? What are the words we would offer to someone we care about? And we can offer them to ourselves. And it's just been this ongoing process. And one day I noticed I was being super hard on myself. And then another voice or another option inside arose and said, well, we don't have to talk to ourselves this way. And I noticed, like, oh, wow, this practice that I've been doing for a while, it just kind of caught me mid moment and redirected the energy a little bit. And it's been with me since. And it's the thing that I love sharing with people the most.
I found that through the practice, I've been able to become more kind to myself and been able to develop more love for myself. And then just like the awareness and the acceptance and the patience that you develop sitting there, you then naturally take it out into the world.
Yeah.
Because I can love myself better, I can love everybody else better. And if you hate yourself, it's really hard to love anybody
Oh.
else. But that's where I started, of course, just like everybody,
Oh.
like, well, it's a better world through more hate. And you're like, well, that
Yeah.
doesn't work. So um, that it's the beauty of the practice that I think both of you and I have seen. And I really think anybody who practices sincerely and sticks with it, that's what they get. That's where they will get to.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing. We practice here at the Temple Buddhist Center, we practice Western Buddhism. Do you
Hmm.
see any real difference between the more traditional Buddhist approach and Western Buddhism?
I do see some differences. When I was younger, I used to really enjoy going to I guess for lack of a better word, the cultural temples. We have a lot of different Buddhist temples here in the DC area. So I would go to the Thai temple and the Sri Lankan temple and the Vietnamese temple and just experience how they practice. And this is like 10 years ago or so. There was a lot more focus on community, that it was just a much more communal hub kind of atmosphere. And the dedication to serious meditation practice was it was up to you to emphasize that. The monastics and the priests, et cetera, they're there to support whatever you're coming for. If you're coming just to spend a day at the temple, great. But if you're coming to practice deeply, that's great too. So I think there was just a little bit more emphasis on community and upholding heritage and culture than what I saw in a lot of the Western Buddhist settings and centers, which seem to be pretty much exclusively practice based. But what I've noticed happening over the years, and I saw this beautifully at Temple Buddhist Center, was that we are beginning to recognize the value of community and just coming together, practicing together, being together, chanting together, and the healing power of being on the path together. And so that's a beautiful evolution that I think I'm seeing in Western Buddhism. And one thing that I love about the Western Buddhist approach is the devotion to practice, is the real energy around wanting to have a regular practice at home, wanting to go on retreat, wanting to not, I'm not saying that that is not there in the traditional lineages that have come to us from Asia. But I'm just saying that, yeah, in Western Buddhism, there's that energy, and I appreciate that energy. Yeah.
So we're running out of time, of course, and we have not gotten to any of the things we agreed to talk about. But a couple of things. Do you want to share very briefly just where we can find you online?
Sure.
And before I let you do that, we'd love to have you back on. I love your approach.
So I'd love to come back on and have more conversations with you and just build a spiritual friendship with you and with your community. And for me, you can find me on Instagram. If you have social media, Instagram's where I'm very active, and my Instagram is just at Born Eye Music, BOR. You can also go to my website, and that's borneyemusic.com, BORN, the letter I, music.com. Those are two great places to start. Yeah.
excellent. Excellent. Born, I thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, you're an excellent teacher, and I love your approach. I also want to thank everybody for joining us for this episode and remind you that you can find Om on the Range on Spotify or YouTube. You can also leave comments for us there. Or if you want, you can email us at omontherange@gmail.com. This is Whit with Om on the Range, signing off and wishing you happy trails. Thanks to our Om on the Range production team for making this program possible, and to Mr. Brad Athey for composing and performing the original music. And to you, our listeners, thank you for being a part of this journey as we explore meditation, Western Buddhism, and the path towards a happier, healthier life. Remember, less suffering and more joy are available to everyone. It just takes practice. Until next time, stay grounded, stay kind, and keep finding peace in the simple, practical things. For all of us here at Om on the Range, happy trails.